The German engineers stood in silence at the edge of the dock, staring down at what remained of U-534. The submarine had been hauled from the depths of the Kattegat, dragged up from the seafloor where she'd rested since May of 1945. Her hull was mangled, crushed by depth charges and the pressure of the deep. But she was intact enough to tell a story the Kriegsmarine survivors had suspected for years, but could never prove. As the salvage crews peeled back the corroded metal and seawater poured from her compartments, the engineers moved through her corridors with clipboards and cameras. They documented everything: the torpedo tubes, the diesel engines, the galley, the cramped bunks where men had slept in shifts. They found personal effects, letters never sent, photographs of women who had probably remarried by now. But there was something they didn't find, something that should have been there, something that had been standard issue on every U-boat that prowled the Atlantic, and its absence explained why so many good men had died screaming in the dark. The Metox receiver was missing. Not damaged, not destroyed. Missing. Ripped out. Removed deliberately before U-534 made her final patrol. And when the engineers cross-referenced the salvage reports with interrogation records from captured submariners, a pattern emerged that turned their blood cold. Across the fleet, in the final months of the war, Metox units were being stripped from submarines on direct orders from Berlin. The crews were told the devices were being upgraded, that newer models were coming. They never came. The men went to sea blind, and they died blind, and now the engineers understood why the kill rates had spiked so dramatically in early 1945. The Allies hadn't just won the technological race. They'd won it so decisively that the German High Command had pulled their own countermeasures rather than let their men know how hopelessly outmatched they'd become. Metox was a radar detector, crude by today's standards, but revolutionary when it was introduced in 1942. It picked up the emissions from Allied search radars, the ASV sets mounted on patrol aircraft and escort vessels. When that detector started crackling, a U-boat commander knew he had minutes, maybe seconds, to crash dive before the bombs started falling. It saved thousands of lives in the early war years. It kept the wolf packs hunting when they should have been hunted. But by 1943, the Allies had adapted. They switched frequencies, refined their tactics, and introduced centimetric radar that Metox couldn't detect. The submarines started dying again, faster than they could be built. And somewhere in the labyrinth of German naval intelligence, a decision was made. If the technology no longer worked, remove it. Don't let the crews know it's obsolete. Don't let them know they're sailing into a fight they can't win. Just pull the equipment and tell them nothing. The man who made that decision likely never set foot on a submarine. He worked in an office far from the salt and the steel. He saw numbers on a page, attrition rates and production schedules. He didn't see the faces of the boys climbing down through the hatches, kissing their girls goodbye, believing the gear they carried would bring them home. Belief is a weapon, and in the Kriegsmarine's final days, it was the only one left. So they let the men believe. They let them sail out into the North Atlantic with faulty torpedoes, dwindling fuel, and gaps in their defenses they didn't even know existed. And when the aircraft came screaming out of the clouds, when the depth charges started tumbling through the water, those men died confused. They died wondering why the alarm never sounded, why they never had a chance. U-534 left Kiel on April 26, 1945. Her commander was Captain Lieutenant Herbert Nollau, a veteran of the Atlantic campaign, and a man who understood the odds. The war was over. Everyone knew it, but the orders kept coming. U-534 was part of a larger operation, a final desperate attempt to evacuate high-ranking officers and sensitive cargo before the Reich collapsed entirely. Some historians believe she was carrying documents, perhaps even personnel connected to the Nazi regime's inner circle. Others think she was just another submarine trying to reach Norway, trying to find some neutral port where her crew might surrender without being slaughtered. The truth went down with her. What's certain is that Nollau and his men knew they were sailing into a shooting gap. The Kattegat was swarming with Allied forces. British aircraft patrolled the skies constantly. Royal Navy destroyers prowled the straits. There was no safe passage, no secret route, just open water and the hope that luck might carry them through. It didn't. On May 5th, 1945, RAF liberators from number 86 Squadron spotted U-534 running on the surface. She was moving fast, trying to cover ground before daylight made her an easy target. But the liberators had centimetric radar. They'd seen her from miles away, tracked her through the darkness, closed the distance before Nollau even knew they were there. The first depth charges hit close enough to shake the hull and send men sprawling. Nollau ordered a crash dive, and the crew responded with the efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times before. Hatches slammed shut. Ballast tanks flooded. The bow tipped down, and and U-534 slid beneath the surface, her electric motors humming as she dove for the safety of the deep. But the liberators stayed overhead. They dropped more charges, walking them across the surface in a pattern designed to bracket the submarine no matter which way she turned. The explosions hammered through the water, compressing and releasing, each shockwave hitting the hull like a giant fist. Inside, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency lanterns came on, casting everything in a red glow that made the cramped corridors look like the inside of a dying animal. Men grabbed hold of pipes and bunks as the submarine pitched and rolled. The depth gauge spun past 100 meters, then 200. Nolau shouted orders, trying to level her out, trying to regain control, but something was wrong. The rudder wasn't responding. The dive planes were jammed. U-534 was sinking bow first, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Water started spraying through a cracked seal near the torpedo room. Not a flood, not yet, but enough to let every man aboard know the hull had been compromised. They could hear it. The hiss of seawater under pressure, the groan of metal beginning to buckle, and they could feel the cold creeping up through the deck plates, seeping into their bones. Nolau made the call. Blow all ballast, surface. If they stayed down, they'd sink to the bottom and die there in the dark. If they surfaced, at least some of them might make it out before the aircraft came back. The ballast tanks roared as compressed air forced the water out. U-534 shuddered, hesitated, then began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, until she broke the surface like a breaching whale. Water cascaded. Nolau threw open the climbed out, shouting for the crew to abandon. Men poured out of the submarine, blinking in the daylight, grabbing life vests, diving into the freezing water. The liberators circled overhead, watching, deciding whether to press the attack or let the men swim. They let them swim. It was May 5th, 1945. The war in Europe had 3 days left. There was no point in wasting ammunition on men who were already beaten. 49 men made it into the water. 3 didn't. They'd been trapped in the aft compartments when the depth charges hit, killed instantly by the shockwave or drowned as the water rushed in. Their bodies stayed with the submarine as she slipped beneath the surface for the last time, settling on the seafloor 60 meters down. The survivors were picked up by Danish resistance fighters and turned over to British forces. They spent the next 2 years in POW camps, waiting for the world to decide what to do with them. Nolau never spoke publicly about the loss of his boat. He died in 1968, taking whatever secrets U-534 carried to his grave. But the submarine herself would eventually talk. In 1993, a Danish salvage team raised U-534 from the seabed. It was a monumental effort, requiring specialized equipment and months of preparation. When she finally broke the surface, she was still recognizable, still unmistakably a Type 1C U-boat despite the damage and decay. The salvage team towed her to Birkenhead, England, where she was placed in a museum. That's where the engineers got their first good look at her. That's where they started finding the gaps. The missing METOX unit was just the beginning. As they cataloged her equipment, they realized that U-534 had been stripped of almost every electronic countermeasure she would have carried earlier in the war. Her Aphrodite radar decoys were gone. Her bold acoustic torpedoes, designed to confuse enemy sonar, were absent. Even her basic hydrophone array had been removed. She'd been sent to sea with her ears cut off and her eyes plucked out, and her crew had never been told. The implications were staggering. If U-534 had been treated this way, how many others had suffered the same fate? The engineers started pulling records, cross-referencing patrol logs with equipment inventories. What they found was a systematic pattern of removal. Starting in late 1944, as the Allied advance closed in on Germany's industrial centers, the Kriegsmarine began cannibalizing its own fleet. Parts were pulled from submarines to keep surface vessels running. Electronics were stripped to equip coastal defense stations. The men who crewed those boats were told nothing, because telling them would mean admitting the war was lost. And the German High Command wasn't ready to admit that. Not in 1944. Not even in April of 1945, when Soviet tanks were rolling through Berlin, and the Führer was huddled in his bunker, screaming at maps that no longer corresponded to reality. So the submarines kept sailing. They kept diving. They kept dying. And the men who survived, the ones who made it to POW camps or managed to scuttle their boats in neutral harbors, carried the weight of those deaths for the rest of their lives. They'd trusted their equipment. They'd trusted their commanders. They'd believed that if they followed orders and did their jobs, they'd have a fighting chance. The discovery of U-534's missing METOX unit proved that trust had been betrayed, not by the Allies, who were simply doing what any enemy would do, but by their own side, by the men in Berlin who sent them to sea, knowing they wouldn't come back. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The Allied dominance in the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just about superior technology or greater industrial capacity. It was about information. By 1943, the Allies had cracked the Enigma code and were reading German naval communications almost in real time. They knew where the wolf packs were forming, which routes the submarines were taking, when and where they planned to strike. The U-boats were still dangerous, still capable of sinking ships and killing men, but they were no longer invisible. The advantage of surprise, which had made them so lethal in the early years of the war, was gone, and once that advantage disappeared, the mathematics of the conflict shifted irreversibly. A submarine could only carry so many torpedoes. It could only stay submerged for so long before it had to surface and recharge its batteries. If the Allies knew where it was, they could position aircraft and escorts to be waiting when it came up. The U-boat crews called it the Valley of Death. That moment when they broke the surface and the sky filled with aircraft. The METOX detector had been their lifeline through that valley. When it chirped, they dove. When it stayed silent, they ran. But as the Allies switched to centimetric radar, METOX became a tombstone. It couldn't detect the new frequencies. The crews didn't know that. They surfaced, heard nothing from their detectors, and assumed the skies were clear. Then the bombs started falling. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The aircraft were already overhead, the depth charges already in the water. Some boats managed to crash dive and survive the first attack. Most didn't survive the second. The Liberators and Sunderlands carried enough ordnance to make multiple runs, and they were patient. They'd circle, wait for the submarine to resurface, then hit it again, over and over, until the hull cracked and the sea poured in. In early 1944, Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet, ordered the development of a new detector, the Naxos, which could pick up centimetric radar. But production was slow and supplies were limited. Only a fraction of the fleet received the upgraded equipment. The rest kept sailing with their obsolete METOX units, kept trusting technology that no longer worked. And when even that failed, when the factories producing Naxos were bombed into rubble and the supply lines collapsed, the High Command made the decision to simply remove the detectors altogether. Better to have no equipment than to have equipment that gave false confidence. Better to have crews who knew they were blind than crews who thought they could see. Except no one told the crews. The detectors were pulled during maintenance, and the men were told they'd be reinstalled before the next patrol. They never were. U-534's final mission was part of Operation Regenbogen, a last-ditch effort to move valuable assets out of Germany before the collapse. Some submarines were tasked with transporting gold and artwork looted from occupied territories. Others carried scientists and engineers whose expertise the Allies would want. A few, according to rumors that have never been confirmed, were loaded with prototype weapons and experimental technology that couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. What U-534 carried remains classified, if records even exist. What's known is that she was heavily loaded, riding low in the water, and that her crew was ordered to avoid combat at all costs. Their job was to deliver the cargo, not to hunt. But avoiding combat in the Kattegat in May of 1945 was like trying to cross a firing range blindfolded. The odds were impossible, and everyone knew it. Nolau was a professional. He'd survived 3 years of Atlantic patrols, had sunk Allied tonnage, had brought his crew home when other commanders hadn't. He knew how to read the ocean, how to anticipate the enemy's moves, how to push his boat to the edge of its capabilities without crossing into recklessness. But even professionals need tools, and the tools he'd relied on were gone. When he took U-534 to sea, he was navigating by instinct and luck, and in modern naval warfare, that wasn't enough. The Liberators found him because their radar painted a perfect picture of the surface. They tracked him because their training and tactics had evolved beyond anything the U-boat fleet could counter. And they sank him because he had no way of knowing they were there until the first depth charge exploded. The men who died on U-534 weren't fanatics or true believers. They were sailors. They joined the Kriegsmarine for a dozen different reasons. Some patriotic, some practical, some because they'd had no other choice. By May of 1945, most of them understood the war was lost. They'd heard the rumors, seen the refugees flooding the ports, watched the supply convoys dwindle to nothing. But they'd also taken an oath, and they believed that oath meant something. So they climbed aboard, secured the hatches, and took their submarine to sea one last time. They did their jobs. They followed orders. And when the bombs came, they fought to save their boat with the same professionalism they'd shown on every other patrol. It wasn't enough. The hull cracked, the compartments flooded, and 3 men drowned in the dark while their comrades abandoned ship above them. The survivors never forgot those three. In POW camps, in the years after the war, in the quiet moments when old men gathered to remember the friends who didn't come home, they spoke their names. They told their stories. They made sure the world knew that those men had been sailors, not monsters, and that they deserved better than to die in the service of a regime that had lied to them from the start. The discovery of U-534's missing equipment gave those survivors a bitter kind of vindication. They'd always suspected they'd been betrayed. Now they had proof. The men in Berlin had sent them to sea knowing the mission was suicide, knowing the equipment didn't work, knowing the Allies controlled the skies and the seas. And they'd done it anyway, because surrender would have been an admission of defeat, and the Nazi leadership would rather sacrifice every U-boat crew in the fleet than admit they'd lost. That's the context in which U-534's missing METOX unit explains Allied dominance. It wasn't just that the Allies had better radar, it was that the Germans had stopped even pretending to compete. By stripping their submarines of defensive equipment, they'd ceded the technological battlefield entirely. They'd turned their crews into cannon fodder, sent them out to die not in the hope of victory, but simply to delay the inevitable. And the Allies, who were monitoring German communications and tracking their movements, recognized this shift. They saw the U-boats becoming easier to find, easier to kill. They pressed their advantage, increased their patrols, refined their tactics. The kill rate for U-boats in 1945 was astronomical compared to earlier years. Not because the Allies had suddenly become better at hunting submarines, but because the submarines had been deliberately hamstrung by their own command. The engineers who studied U-534 published their findings in a series of technical journals that most people never read. The story didn't make headlines, it didn't change the history books, but it mattered to the men who'd survived, and it mattered to the families of the men who hadn't. It was proof that their loved ones had been sacrificed not for the fatherland, not for some grand strategic purpose, but because a handful of men in Berlin had been too cowardly to face the truth. The war was over. Germany had lost. And every sailor who died in those final weeks died for nothing except the preservation of an illusion. There's a photograph from the salvage operation taken just after U-534 was raised. It shows the submarine's conning tower breaking the surface, water streaming off the rusted metal, gulls circling overhead. In the foreground, barely visible, is one of the salvage divers standing on the deck. He's looking down into the open hatch, into the darkness below. You can't see his face, but his posture says everything. There's a weight to it, a recognition of what this boat represents. Not just a machine, but a tomb. Not just a relic of war, but evidence of a crime. The crime of sending men to their deaths when the fight was already lost. The missing METOX unit is a small thing, a single piece of equipment in a larger system. But small things matter. The absence of a radar detector meant the absence of warning. The absence of warning meant the absence of choice. And the absence of choice meant that when the liberators came screaming out of the clouds, the men on U-534 had no chance to dive, no chance to run, no chance to fight. They could only wait for the impact and hope the hull would hold. It didn't, and when the water rushed in and the lights went out and the submarine began her final descent, those men understood in the last moments of their lives that they'd been abandoned, not by their comrades who fought beside them until the end, but by the command structure that had promised to protect them and had instead stripped them of the tools they needed to survive. That's the real story of U-534, not the mystery of her cargo or the drama of her sinking. The real story is the systematic betrayal of her crew, a betrayal that extended across the entire U-boat fleet in the final months of the war. Hundreds of submarines went to sea without proper equipment. Thousands of men died because the technology they relied on had been removed or sabotaged or simply left to rot in some warehouse while the Reich crumbled around it. The Allies didn't just outfight the Kriegsmarine, they outlasted it, outproduced it, and outthought it at every level. And when the German High Command realized they couldn't win, they made the decision to let their men keep dying rather than admit defeat. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. After the war, the U-boat veterans formed associations, groups where survivors could gather and share their stories without judgment. They weren't looking for sympathy or glory, they just wanted to be heard. They wanted people to understand that they'd been sailors, not war criminals, and that their service had cost them everything: homes, families, futures. Some of them had spent years in POW camps. Others had returned to a Germany that no longer existed, where their cities had been bombed into rubble and their loved ones scattered or dead. They carried scars, physical and psychological, that never fully healed. and they carried questions. Why had they been sent to sea in boats that couldn't defend themselves? Why had their commanders lied about the equipment? Why had the High Command sacrificed them when the war was already lost? The study of U-534 provided some answers, but not the ones they wanted. It confirmed their suspicions, validated their anger, but it didn't bring back the dead. It didn't change the fact that 3 men had drowned in that submarine while their comrades swam for their lives. It didn't erase the memory of the depth charges, the screaming, the desperate scramble to reach the surface before the water filled their lungs. The survivors lived with those memories for decades, and many of them died before the submarine was raised, before the truth came. They died believing they'd failed somehow, that if they'd been better sailors or braver men, they might have survived when others hadn't. The discovery of the missing equipment absolved them of that guilt. It proved that courage and skill weren't enough when the system itself was rigged against them. The British engineers who studied U-534 treated her with respect. They understood what she represented, not just as a piece of military hardware, but as a grave. They cataloged every artifact, photographed every compartment, documented every detail, and when they found the gaps where equipment should have been, they didn't gloat or celebrate. They simply noted it in their reports and moved on, because they understood, on some level, that the men who'd crewed this boat had been victims too. Not victims in the same sense as the people who'd suffered under Nazi occupation, but victims nonetheless of a regime that consumed its own people as readily as it consumed its enemies. There's a technical aspect to this story that's worth understanding. Radar detection wasn't just about avoiding aircraft, it was about managing energy and resources. A submarine operating on the surface could move faster and recharge its batteries more efficiently than one running submerged. But surfacing meant exposure. The METOX detector allowed commanders to surface at night, when visibility was low, and still have warning if an aircraft approached. Without that detector, surfacing became a gamble. Some commanders took the risk, figuring the speed and battery charge were worth it. Others stayed submerged as much as possible, creeping through the water at a snail's pace, conserving power, hoping to avoid detection through stealth alone. Both strategies had drawbacks. The aggressive commanders got spotted and killed. The cautious ones ran out of fuel or battery power and had to surface anyway, often in daylight, often in areas thick with Allied patrols. Nolau chose aggression. He ran U-534 on the surface as much as possible, pushing for maximum speed, trying to cover the distance to Norway before the net closed in. It was a calculated risk, and it nearly worked. He made it through the Skagerrak, past the Allied picket lines, into the Kattegat. Another 50 miles and he would have reached the Norwegian coast. Another day and he might have found safe harbor. But the liberators found him first, and without the METOX detector, he never knew they were coming. The first indication he had of their presence was the splash of depth charges hitting the water. By then, it was too late to dive effectively. He tried, but the charges were already bracketing his position, and the shockwaves hit before U-534 could reach safe depth. The physics of depth charge attacks are brutal. The explosives don't have to hit the submarine directly. They just have to detonate close enough that the pressure wave propagates through the water and impacts the hull. Water is incompressible, which means the shockwave travels through it with incredible efficiency. When a depth charge explodes, it creates a bubble of expanding gas that compresses the surrounding water, then collapses back on itself, creating a secondary shockwave. If a submarine is caught in that cycle, the hull experiences repeated compression and expansion, flexing beyond its design tolerances. Welds crack, seals fail, plates buckle. And once the hull integrity is compromised, the ocean does the rest. Water floods in through the cracks, overwhelming the pumps, adding weight, dragging the submarine down. Nolau's crew fought that flood with everything they had. They jammed mattresses into the cracks, wrapped chains around fractured pipes, manned the pumps until their arms gave out, but the damage was too extensive. The forward torpedo room was flooding faster than they could pump it out. The rudder was jammed to port, making it impossible to steer, and the dive planes, which controlled the submarine's depth, were stuck in the down position, meaning U-534 was sinking despite their efforts to level her out. Nolau made the only decision he could: surface, abandon ship, save as many men as possible. It was the right call, but it didn't feel right. It felt like surrender. It felt like failure. And for a man who'd spent 3 years fighting the Atlantic, who'd sunk Allied ships and evaded Allied hunters, and brought his crew home time and time again, it was a bitter end. The 3 men who died didn't have time to feel anything. The depth charge that killed them detonated close enough to the aft section that the shockwave simply stopped their hearts. They were unconscious before the water reached them, dead before they could drown. It's a small mercy, but it's the only one they got. Their bodies stayed with the submarine for 48 years, entombed in the flooded compartments, preserved by the cold and the darkness. When U-534 was raised, those bodies were gone, dissolved by the sea, leaving only fragments of uniform and personal effects. The salvage team recovered what they could, treated it with dignity, ensured the families were notified, but there wasn't much to recover. The ocean had claimed them as thoroughly as the war had. The museum in Birkenhead displays U-534 in sections, cut apart to allow visitors to walk through her compartments and see how the crew lived and worked. It's an eerie experience, standing in those narrow corridors, looking at the bunks where men slept, the galley where they ate, the control room where they fought to save their boat. The air smells of rust and old metal. The walls are stained with decades of corrosion, and everywhere you look, there are reminders of the men who died here. Not just the 3 who went down with the boat, but the 46 who survived only to spend years in captivity, and the thousands of others who crewed U-boats throughout the war and never made it home. The missing METOX unit is mentioned on a plaque near the control room. It's a small notation, easy to miss if you're not looking for it, but it's there, a quiet acknowledgement of the betrayal that cost so many lives. The plaque doesn't editorialize, it simply states the facts. U-534 was missing key defensive equipment at the time of her sinking. Similar deficiencies were found across the U-boat fleet in the final months of the war. These deficiencies contributed to the high casualty rates experienced by German submariners. It's dry, technical language, the kind you'd find in an engineering report. But for the families of the men who died, for the survivors who've walked through this museum and stood in front of that plaque, the words carry a weight that no amount of dramatic prose could match. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The broader lesson of U-534 extends beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. It's a lesson about what happens when military leadership prioritizes ideology over the welfare of the men under their command. The decision to strip submarines of defensive equipment wasn't made for tactical reasons. It was made because the resources didn't exist to maintain those systems, and because admitting that fact would have required admitting the war was lost. So instead of withdrawing the submarines, instead of preserving the lives of trained crew members who might be needed in the post-war period, the High Command sent them to sea and let them die. It was a decision driven by pride, by denial, by the toxic combination of authoritarianism and incompetence that characterized the Nazi regime in its final days. The Allies recognized this pattern and exploited it ruthlessly. Intelligence reports from 1945 noted the decreasing effectiveness of U-boat defensive measures. Allied commanders adjusted their tactics accordingly, becoming more aggressive, more willing to take risks, knowing that the submarines they were hunting had been neutered. The kill rate soared. In March of 1945 alone, 33 U-boats were sunk. In April, another 46. In May, before the surrender, 25 more. These weren't just machines being destroyed. They were crews, 40 to 50 men per boat. Thousands of lives snuffed out in the span of a few weeks. Some of them died fighting. Some of them died trying to surrender. And some of them, like the men on U-534, died simply because they'd been sent to sea without the tools they needed to defend themselves. The Cold War brought renewed interest in German submarine technology. Both the Americans and the Soviets wanted to understand how the U-boats had operated, what made them effective, what their weaknesses had been. They studied captured submarines, interrogated surviving crew members, pored over technical documents that had been seized from naval archives. What they found was a mixed picture. The Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats were well-designed, reliable platforms. Their diesel-electric propulsion systems were efficient. Their torpedo systems, when they worked, were deadly. But the operational doctrine, the way the boats were deployed and managed, was fundamentally flawed. The Kriegsmarine had treated its submarines as expendable assets, throwing them into combat without adequate support, without proper intelligence, without the defensive systems they needed to survive. It was a waste of technology and a waste of human life, and it taught the Cold War powers a valuable lesson about the importance of integrated systems and comprehensive training. U-534's story also highlights the role of individual decision-making in military operations. Nolau had options, even with degraded equipment. He could have refused the mission, citing the lack of defensive systems. He could have altered his route, taken a longer but safer path to Norway. He could have stayed submerged for the entire journey, accepting the slower speed and higher risk of battery failure. But he was a product of his time and his training. He'd been raised in a military culture that valued obedience and discouraged questioning orders. When he was told to take U-534 to sea, he saluted and did it. And when he realized the mission was going to kill him and his crew, he did everything in his power to save as many men as possible. That's not heroism in the traditional sense. It's just professionalism, the kind of steady competence that keeps militaries functioning even when the cause is lost and the leadership is corrupt. The 46 survivors of U-534 were scattered across multiple POW camps. Some ended up in England, others in Canada, a few in the United States. They were interrogated, their stories recorded, their technical knowledge extracted and filed away for future reference. Most of them cooperated fully. The war was over, and they had no reason to protect a regime that had betrayed them. They talked about their training, their missions, the equipment they'd used, and when they talked about the missing METOX units, the Allied interrogators took note. It confirmed what intelligence had already suggested, that the U-boat fleet was falling apart from within, that the vaunted Kriegsmarine was a hollow shell by the spring of 1945. This information didn't change the outcome of the war, but it did inform post-war naval policy, particularly around the importance of maintaining technological parity with potential adversaries. No Lao was released from POW camp in 1947. He returned to Germany, to a country he barely recognized. The cities he'd known were gone, replaced by rubble and refugee camps. His family had survived, but they'd lost everything. He worked odd jobs for a few years, saved enough money to start a small business, tried to build a normal life, but the war stayed with him. In the 1960s, when the first reunions of U-boat veterans began, he attended a few but found he had nothing to say. The other survivors wanted to swap stories, relive the glory days, remember the battles they'd won. No Lao remembered the battles they'd lost, the men who died, the orders that had sent them to sea without the equipment they needed. He didn't have patience for nostalgia or revisionism. He'd been there, he'd seen what it cost, and he knew the truth, even if no one wanted to hear it. When U-534 was raised in 1993, No Lao had been dead for 25 years. He never saw the photographs of his boat, never read the reports about the missing equipment, never got the vindication of knowing that history had proven him right. But his crew, the ones who survived, they saw it. They read the reports. They walked through the museum displays, and they finally had evidence to support what they'd always believed, that they'd been betrayed by their own command, sent to die for a cause that was already lost, sacrificed on the altar of Nazi ideology. It didn't bring their shipmates back. It didn't erase the trauma or the years in captivity, but it gave them a measure of peace, a confirmation that they hadn't failed. The system had failed them. The Allied dominance in the Battle of the Atlantic was the result of many factors: superior production capacity, better intelligence, more advanced technology, effective coordination between naval and air forces. But it was also the result of German incompetence, of a command structure so rigid and ideologically driven that it couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. The decision to strip U-boats of defensive equipment is just one example of this incompetence, but it's a telling one. It shows a leadership more concerned with appearances than reality, more willing to sacrifice lives than admit failure, and it explains, in microcosm, why the Third Reich collapsed so completely. You can't win a war when you're lying to your own soldiers. You can't sustain a military when you're cannibalizing your own equipment. You can't demand loyalty from men you've betrayed. The men who crewed U-534 deserved better. They deserved commanders who valued their lives. They deserved equipment that worked. They deserved honest communication about the state of the war and the odds they faced. They didn't get any of that. What they got was a mission that killed 3 of them and condemned the rest to years of imprisonment. What they got was a place in history as a cautionary tale about the cost of authoritarian leadership and strategic incompetence. And what they left behind was a submarine on the bottom of the Kattegat, a tomb that would eventually speak for them, that would tell the story they couldn't tell, that would prove, continuar 1251, to the world they'd been right to doubt their orders. U-534 sits in that museum now, her hull cut open, her secrets exposed. Visitors walk through her compartments and try to imagine what it was like, living in those cramped spaces, breathing recycled air, knowing that every time you surfaced could be the last. They look at the bunks, the control panels, the torpedo tubes. They read the plaques and study the photographs, and if they're paying attention, if they look closely at the section describing the defensive systems, they'll see that notation about the missing METOX unit. They'll see the proof that these men were sent to die, not because the enemy was too strong, but because their own side had given up on them. It's a small thing, a single missing component in a complex system, But small things matter, and sometimes the absence of something tells a story louder than its presence ever could.